The father of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, warned us all the way back in the 1930s in his famous lectures on the crisis of European sciences about the ominous effects of positivism and the scientific method colonizing all other branches of knowledge and the humanities and becoming the most trusted discourse when it comes to analyzing reality and also human phenomena. He warned us about the limitations of relying purely on facts and what is experimentally demonstrable, and he reminded us of the need for philosophy to transcend the often very limited capabilities, and this may sound controversial, of self-reference systems such as logic or mathematics, or what is quote-unquote experimentally demonstrable. Human phenomena are so complex that they require a type of reflection that goes beyond the laboratory, that goes beyond simple quantitative tools of analysis. So how is it that scientific discourse displaced other forms of analysis in the humanities, although fortunately today that is something that has been severely critiqued from very different areas of the humanities? But how is it that science became so powerful as a discourse that it began to colonize different areas of social sciences, of research in the humanities? How is it that Habermas was able to connect science with capitalism to the point of proposing that science was a form and is a form of ideology? And how is it that using Foucault's analysis of how discourse becomes an institution and is embedded with power relations and is never marginalized from the way in which society works, how is it that we can understand the way in which science and the scientific method have become an ideology and have an institutional impact on the way in which research is carried out across universities in different areas of the world? With that in mind, I want to take a look at the history of epistemology and the way in which Western philosophy has thought about what knowledge is, how we can interpret and know reality, when did scientific discourse emerge, and how it relates to capitalism, politics, ideology, and power relations in the contemporary world. So to begin our historical journey, we must start with the pre-Socratics, because the pre-Socratics are the founders of the logos and rationality and the belief that the cosmos can be understood without relying on myths. The pre-Socratics were preoccupied with the problem of being, so their problem was ontological in nature. They wanted to find out if being dwells on the level of essence or on the level of appearance. And they found, as we often don't marvel at because we take it for granted, but if we look at the world that we can perceive through our senses, we will discover that there are thousands and thousands of objects, from stars to mountains to the rivers to buildings to living things. And the question is there an underlying substance or essence? Substance is more of an Aristotelian term, but is there an essence that is common to everything that exists in the cosmos, something that is present both in stars, planets, and living things? Of course, with modern chemistry, we might be tempted to reduce the ontological problem of whether being resides in the essence or in the appearance of reality by just saying that everything is made up of atoms. And of course, a galaxy, even a black hole, a star, planets, living things, everything is made up of atoms. Of course, there's antimatter and dark matter. But the problem that the pre-Socratics proposed almost 3 millennia ago is not just finding out what matter is made up of, but actually determining what is more real. If it's more real to look at that essence of the cosmos or to dwell at the level of the appearance. And if so, how can we tell what is more real? And so the pre-Socratics determined that what we perceive through our senses is an illusion. So we have, for example, the disciple of Parmenides on the south of Italy, what would be the south of Italy today. who proposed a series of paradoxes to demonstrate how time, movement, and change are illusory, and the reality is the immutable essence whereby being resides, and that essence can only be known through rationality, mathematics, logos. It can never be known through the senses because the senses are subject to time and therefore to change, and they lead eventually to what Plato would call in the myth of the cavern the shadows that the prisoners confuse with reality. So Plato is highly influenced by the pre-Socratics. What does this have to do with epistemology and knowledge? Well, all the way back in Western thought to the pre-Socratics, nearly 3 millennia ago, we find the roots of that distinction between rationality and sense experience, between the mind, ideas, and the body, which is why Nietzsche, for example, is going to be so critical of that type of metaphysical philosophy that detaches itself from the human body as the source of experience. That is why phenomenology in Ponty, for example, is going to try and get back to the body as the main source of existential experience and what determines consciousness and how we perceive reality. So all the way back in Western thought to the pre-Socratics and Plato, we have that distinction between reality and the senses. Reality is placed above all other forms of knowledge. Rationality, and rationality is viewed as the type of knowledge that can allow us to understand reality at a fundamental level, which is the level where being truly resides, the essence. After the ancient approach of philosophy, whereby being is seen as an objective reality, and there is no reflection about interpretation from the subject except from the sophists, who claim, for example, Protagoras and Gorgias, who claim that reality is a human construct and a linguistic creation, interpretation that is mediated by social and historical processes. Aside from that, we don't really get a reflection on the role of the subject or even any ideas about interpretation. Being objectively resides either in what the pre-Socratics called the underlying principle of the cosmos, or in the universal and absolute ideas that make up Plato's world of ideas. But it is only until modern philosophy that the relation to being changes, and therefore to knowledge, in a substantial way. Descartes is the first to introduce the subject, the faculties with which the mind interprets reality. And he famously says, "I think, therefore I exist," because he applies something that is called the methodic doubt to claim that every form of knowledge is susceptible to being doubted and to be treated as false. What cannot be subject to doubt, however, is the fact that we exist because we think. So he is introducing a new framework in which there is a subject and there is a reality that is treated almost like an object of interpretation. Then we have David Hume, John Locke, and all the school of empiricism and empirical thought, and they determined that the senses are the primary way in which we interpret reality. David Hume explicitly says on Inquiry on Human Understanding that ideas derive from sense experience. So it's not the Cartesian substance of the rational subject that is a priori, but ideas derive from sense experience. And then we go all the way to the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant, and there Kant makes the distinction in Latin between the noumena, which is the thing in itself, and the phenomenon, which is what the mind interprets, the mind of the subject, the transcendental subject of knowledge. And Kant says that there are a priori conditions that allow the subject to know reality through sense experience and through rationality, and he calls them the a priori transcendental conditions of knowledge. And he analyzes the transcendental conditions that allow sense experience to gather information and perceptions about reality, and he also analyzes the categories, which are the a priori basis of understanding and rationality. So those two faculties together, they create phenomena. Now we have Hegel, and Hegel introduces dialectical thinking. He proposes that there is the idea of the absolute, but the absolute needs to project itself onto its opposite, which is the particular and subjective, and it does that through the dialectical process of history. So Hegel introduces history as an organic and dialectical process that has the teleological end, or the purpose, of allowing the idea of the absolute to be complete in its opposite and to know itself through the dialectical confrontation with the particular or the subjective. And after Hegel, in the 19th century still, we come across different disciplines that drift away from the metaphysical, from the preoccupation of the subject in modern philosophy, and they claim that reality can be known objectively through the scientific method. Now, these tendencies are marveled by the success of Newtonian physics. Remember that Newtonian physics was able to describe the three laws of motion, the universal law of gravity, and it was able to predict mechanical phenomena to unbelievable certainty. It was only until the 20th century that astronomers became aware that the equations Newton developed didn't allow to explain fully the orbit of Mercury, for example. So onto the stage of scientific discourse comes Einstein's relativity. But before that, Newtonian physics was perceived as absolute. Remember Laplace saying to Napoleon that if he knows the initial conditions of particles in the universe, he would be able to predict in any time, in any point in space, what they will be. So determinism, in the sense Laplace is communicating to Napoleon, is the reflection of how absolute Newtonian mechanics was perceived. Uncertainty begins to form cracks from Einstein, of course, but then most decisively within scientific discourse with quantum mechanics. So you have the double slit experiment, the famous cat in the box paradox by Erwin Schrödinger. You have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and these ideas of quantum mechanics, all the way from Max Planck, begin to form cracks in the perceived absolute certainty of Newtonian mechanics. But, however, despite uncertainty being introduced in scientific discourse, still scientific discourse linked to capitalism in the 20th century especially becomes not only a discourse, not only a method, but a force of production. And Marx was able to describe in the development of industrial capitalism in Victorian England how in the Grundrisse, for example, his famous notes on political economy, which serve as a laboratory for capital, how scientific knowledge is a force of production and it drives technological development, which increases constant capital and displaces variable capital or human labor, and that has some very concrete economical and social effects. So as soon as science becomes identified with a force of production and therefore with technological development, all sorts of interesting issues arise. Namely, science becomes an ideology because there is an economic interest underlying the way in which scientific knowledge is produced, and therefore the status of truth and the claim of truth and the methodological characteristics of scientific knowledge are determined by those economic demands and by the logic of capital. And therefore the way in which scientific discourse becomes an institution in universities, for example, implies a discourse, as Foucault would say, relations of power that eventually derive into social practices, and those vary from the level of the doctors in clinics and hospitals. Remember the gaze of the doctor that Foucault analyzes, all the way to research and how quantitative research methods became hailed as the only way to know reality.